Here is a story that almost nobody outside Russia knows. In the year 1908, the Russian Physicians' Society in Moscow dispatched a 20-year-old woman named Irina Sakharova on a covert mission to the Caucasus Mountains. Her assignment was to obtain, by any means necessary, a small quantity of living grains that the mountain communities of the region had been guarding for centuries as a closely held secret. The grains were considered a gift from the Prophet Muhammad in some local traditions, and from the Christian saints in others. The mountain communities considered the grains sacred and refused to share them with outsiders. Sakharova traveled to the region under the protection of a local prince. She was kidnapped by mountain tribesmen, held captive, and, according to the tradition of the time, was nearly forced into marriage to her abductor. She was awarded compensation by the Russian courts. She accepted the compensation in the form of 10 pounds of the grains she had originally been sent to obtain. Those 10 pounds of grains, brought back to Moscow in 1908, became the seed stock for nearly all commercial Kefir production in Russia, Europe, and eventually North America over the following century. The mountain communities that had guarded the grains for 3,000 years lost their monopoly within a single generation. If you are new here, subscribe. To understand why the Russian government sent a young woman on a kidnapping-grade mission to obtain a few pounds of fermented milk grains, you have to understand what Kefir actually is and why nothing else like it exists in the world. Kefir grains are not seeds. They are not a fungus. They are not any single organism. They are a symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeasts, typically containing somewhere between 10 and 50 distinct microbial species embedded in a matrix of polysaccharide material that the microorganisms produce themselves. The matrix is called Kefir. It is a unique compound that forms the structural framework holding the entire microbial community together in small cauliflower-shaped clusters that range in size from a grain of rice to a walnut. When fresh milk is added to Kefir grains, the colony begins fermenting the milk sugar lactose into lactic acid, carbon dioxide, and small amounts of alcohol. The process takes between 12 and 24 hours at room temperature. The finished product is a thick, slightly fizzy, tangy drink that contains the entire microbial community in active living form. This is the central comparison with yogurt that the title of this video promises. Yogurt is produced through the action of two specific bacterial species, Lactobacillus delbrueckii, subsp. Bulgaricus, and Streptococcus thermophilus. In some commercial yogurts, additional strains are added to provide marketing distinction. But the underlying fermentation is driven by these two organisms. 2 to 4 bacterial species total in most commercial yogurts. Kefir contains between 10 and 50 bacterial and yeast species in active living form, 25 times the microbial diversity in some commercial comparisons. Subscribe if you want more of these stories. The microbial diversity matters because the human gut microbiome is itself enormously diverse. Containing hundreds of bacterial species in healthy adults, a fermented food that delivers 10 to 50 live organisms simultaneously provides substantially more microbial input than a fermented food delivering 2 to 4 organisms. A 2014 study published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health documented the specific microbial composition of Kefir grains across multiple regional samples. The findings consistently identified between 15 and 30 species, including Lactobacillus kefirano-faciens, Lactobacillus kefiri, Lactococcus, Lactus, Streptococcus, Thermophilus, multiple yeast species including Saccharomyces, Cerevisia, and Clivoromyces, Marxianus, and various acetic acid bacteria. The composition varied by region, but the diversity was consistent. This is the core of what made Kefir so unusual and what made the Russian Imperial Medical Society so determined to obtain it. The fermentation was producing not just a preserved food, but a complex microbial inoculation that no one in Western medical science had ever produced under laboratory conditions. The mountain communities of the Caucasus had been making Kefir for an unknown length of time when European medical science first documented it in the late 1800s. The region's geography is specific. The Caucasus Mountains form a wall between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, running roughly 700 miles from west to east. The mountain communities scattered across this range include speakers of dozens of distinct languages across families, including Northeast Caucasian, Northwest Caucasian, Kartvalian, and Indo-European. The communities are notably isolated, with each valley historically maintaining its own dialect and traditions. Within this complex cultural landscape, the production of kefir emerged as a shared practice across many of the mountain peoples. The grain itself was treated as a near-sacred object. In some traditions, the grains were said to have been given to Muhammad by the archangel Gabriel during the prophet's lifetime in the 7th century AD. In other traditions, the grains predated Islam entirely and were associated with Christian saints who had brought the gift to the mountain communities. In still other traditions, the grains were considered ancestral and were thought to have descended in unbroken lineage from the earliest days of human pastoral life in the mountains. Archaeological evidence in the broader Caucasus region documents fermented milk consumption, extending back several thousand years. Specific evidence for kefir grain use as opposed to general milk fermentation is harder to date archaeologically because the grains themselves do not preserve in the soil. What is well documented is that by the late 1800s, Caucasus mountain communities had a centuries-old tradition of using kefir, grains that they considered a defining cultural property of the region. The grains were transmitted only through family lines. They were given as wedding gifts, were carried during migrations, were considered protected community property that outsiders could not legitimately receive. By the 1880s, Russian medical researchers had identified kefir as a candidate for therapeutic application in tuberculosis treatment, gastrointestinal disease management, and general nutritional support in hospital and sanatorium contexts. The problem was supply. The grains could not be manufactured. They could only be propagated from existing colonies, and the mountain communities controlled all known sources. Multiple attempts to obtain grains through legitimate trade failed completely. The mountain communities understood the commercial value of what they held and refused all offers. This is the context for the 1908 expedition. The Russian Physicians' Society dispatched Irina Sakharova specifically because the conventional approaches had failed. The mission used the prestige and influence of a local prince to gain access to the closely guarded grains. When Sakharova was abducted by the prince's rivals during the negotiation, the situation escalated into a diplomatic incident that required the intervention of Russian imperial courts. The court eventually awarded Sakharova substantial compensation for the harm she had endured. She accepted that compensation in the form of the grains she had been sent to obtain, which the court ordered the responsible parties to surrender as part of the settlement. 10 pounds of grains arrived in Moscow. The Russian Physicians' Society distributed the grains to dairies across Russia. Commercial kefir production began at industrial scale within 5 years. By 1930, Russian sanitariums were producing kefir as part of standard medical nutrition protocols. By 1960, kefir was a standard refrigerator item in nearly every Soviet household. By 1990, Russian kefir had spread to Eastern European markets, and from there to Western Europe, and eventually North America. The mountain communities that had guarded the grains for centuries saw their monopoly destroyed by a single 20-year-old woman acting under Russian government direction. The grain still exists in Caucasian villages today, but the global commercial supply descends almost entirely from those 10 pounds taken to Moscow in 1908. The modern peer-reviewed research on kefir has accumulated quietly since the 1990s and accelerated significantly in the past 15 years. The findings consistently support several traditional applications that mountain communities had identified empirically across centuries. The gastrointestinal research is the most developed area. Multiple clinical studies have documented benefits in lactose intolerance, where the bacterial enzyme activity in kefir breaks down most of the lactose during fermentation. Dairy product that many lactose-intolerant individuals can consume without the digestive distress they experience from regular milk. Irritable bowel syndrome, where regular kefir consumption appears to improve symptom scores in several controlled trials. Inflammatory bowel disease, where preliminary research suggests the diverse microbial community in kefir may help modulate gut inflammation in conditions including Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Helicobacter pylori infection, where kefir consumption alongside conventional antibiotic therapy appears to improve eradication. Rates of the bacteria responsible for most peptic ulcers. 2015 review in the Journal of Pharmaceutical Analysis synthesized data on Kefir's broader pharmacological profile. The findings included documented effects on immune system modulation, with both anti-inflammatory effects in some contexts and immune-stimulating effects in others, suggesting the complex microbial community produces multiple regulatory compounds simultaneously. Cardiovascular markers with modest reductions in cholesterol and blood pressure documented in several controlled trials. Blood sugar regulation, with preliminary evidence for improvements in insulin sensitivity in both animal models and small human studies. Antimicrobial activity against several pathogens, including foodborne bacteria that cause common gastrointestinal infections. Anti-cancer activity in laboratory cell culture studies, though this work remains preclinical and does not establish Kefir as a cancer treatment. The compounds responsible for these effects include the bacterial metabolites produced during fermentation, the Kefirin polysaccharide itself, and various bioactive peptides released when the milk proteins are partially digested by the microbial community. What is unusual about Kefir's research profile is the consistency of findings across multiple disease categories. Most single fermented foods show effects in one or two narrow areas. Kefir's effects span gastrointestinal, immune, cardiovascular, and metabolic categories in ways that suggest the microbial diversity itself is doing something different from what simpler fermented foods accomplish. The honest framing here matters. Most of this research involves modest effects in controlled studies with limited sample sizes. Kefir is not a medical treatment for any specific condition. It is a food with documented bioactive properties that may support general health through mechanisms involving microbiome diversity, metabolite production, and immune modulation. For someone interested in fermented food traditions, with substantial cultural longevity and a growing research base, a unique position that yogurt and other simpler fermented dairy products do not match. The practical reality of using kefir today depends entirely on whether you want to make it yourself or purchase commercial versions. Commercial kefir is widely available in American grocery stores under brands including Lifeway, Maple Hill, Wallaby, and various store brands. Commercial versions typically range from $4 to $7 per quart and provide a reasonable approximation of traditional kefir. The microbial diversity in commercial kefir is generally lower than in traditional grain-fermented kefir, because commercial production often uses standardized starter cultures rather than full living grains. This is not necessarily a problem. Commercial kefir still provides substantially more microbial diversity than yogurt or other common fermented dairy products, but it represents a simplified version of the traditional product. For home production using actual grains, the entry barrier is straightforward. Acquire grains. This is the only step that requires effort. Kefir grains are typically obtained through online suppliers, including Cultures for Health and Yimu's Nourishing Cultures, which ship grains in dormant or active form for prices ranging from $15 to $35. Local fermentation enthusiasts, identified through online communities, who often share excess grains for free or trade. Some Eastern European grocery stores, particularly in regions with substantial Russian, Ukrainian, or Caucasian immigrant communities. Once you have grains, the process is remarkably simple. Place 1 to 2 tablespoons of grains in a clean glass jar. Pour in 2 cups of fresh milk, cow, goat, or sheep milk, all work. Cover the jar with a breathable cloth secured with a rubber band. Leave at room temperature for 12 to 24 hours. The exact time depends on temperature and your taste preference. Warmer rooms ferment faster. Longer fermentation produces stronger, more tangy kefir. Strain through a non-metal strainer to separate the grains from the finished kefir. The grains can be immediately added to fresh milk to begin the next batch. The finished kefir is ready to drink, or can be flavored with fruit, honey, or vanilla, or used as a base for smoothies, salad dressings, or baked goods. The grains continue propagating indefinitely. A small starter colony of 1 to 2 tablespoons typically doubles every few weeks under regular use, giving you growing colonies that you can share with others or use to scale up your own production. There are several important practical considerations. First, do not use metal utensils with kefir grains. The grains are sensitive to certain metals, particularly copper and aluminum, which can damage the microbial community over time. Use glass jars, plastic strainers, and wooden or silicone utensils. Stainless steel is generally tolerated for brief contact but is not recommended for long-term storage. Second, the alcohol content of kefir varies. Traditional fermented kefir typically contains less than 1% alcohol, similar to the alcohol content of well-ripened bananas. Longer fermentation can produce slightly higher alcohol levels, up to 2 or 3%, which is significant for people avoiding alcohol entirely. For most practical purposes, the alcohol content is comparable to non-alcoholic beverages and well below any meaningful intoxication threshold. Third, people with severe immunocompromise, including those undergoing chemotherapy, organ transplant recipients, and individuals with advanced HIV should discuss kefir consumption with a physician before adding it to their diet. The live microbial content that makes kefir biologically active can occasionally cause infections in severely immunocompromised individuals. For healthy adults and most people with normal immune function, kefir is well tolerated, and the bacterial content is the source of its benefits, not a risk. What you have, when you maintain a small colony of kefir grains in your kitchen, is direct cultural participation in a food tradition that began somewhere in the Caucasus Mountains at least 3,000 years ago, survived centuries of careful guarding by mountain communities, was acquired by Russian medical science through a documented kidnapping incident in 1908. It spread across the Soviet Union and eventually the world. Now sits in your refrigerator producing one of the most microbially diverse fermented foods available anywhere. The grains will continue producing kefir as long as you continue feeding them milk. A starter colony given as a wedding gift in 1885 may still be in active use today. In dozens of different households descended an unbroken biological lineage from the original community in the mountain valley that first cultivated it. This is one of the few foods on Earth where the living organisms producing your food today are the same organisms that produced food for your great-great-grandparents, if any of them happened to live in the Caucasus. The tradition has not been broken. It has only been quietly extended. If you obtain kefir grains this week, your first homemade batch will be ready by the weekend. Subscribe if you want more videos on the specific food traditions that survived being kept secret for centuries, and now sit accessible to anyone willing to learn how they work.